Hello, I'm Michael Killen, and you and I are probably very concerned with the impact of climate change on the transformation of our civilization. Climate change does hold the threat to change civilization, and there's probably only about 5 different solutions that can help stop climate change. On this show, we're going to discuss one of them, and that is a tax and carbon and a dividend that is distributed to the public. I have invited an economist. His name is Jonathan Marshall, and he's not only an economist, he has been an editor for various newspapers, and he is also a member of an organization that is dedicated to trying to influence the Congress to implement a carbon tax. And that organization is Citizen Climate Lobby. I'm going to ask Jonathan a lot of questions.
All right.
Jonathan, did the introduction make sense?
It did to me, yes.
Did it put me in context?
Sure. As you said, I think every one of us really has to face this crisis. It's so big, most of us want to put our head in the sand because what to do about it. It can lead to kind of depression or just alienation. But if we put our minds to it, there are solutions. And I think solutions are not only essential to our own fate and that of our children and grandchildren, but frankly also to our mental health.
Yes.
We better do something about it.
And when I talk about the transformation of civilization, this painting behind us hints
Yes.
at where we could be going. This is cave people have emerged in the world after us, and here they have painted their cave art on our icons of our civilization, like E equals MC square. There's a woman with an iPhone. We don't want this to happen. But before I start asking you some questions about the carbon tax and the work you've done, I mentioned, but I don't really remember the details, or I haven't articulated them. Who are some of the organizations you have worked for and some of the organizations that have published your economic work?
Sure. Well, I had a long career in journalism, much of it focused on economics, both as an opinion writer, as an editorial writer for the San Jose Mercury News, and editorial page editor for the Oakland Tribune when it was still a large paper in California, and as economics editor of the San Francisco Chronicle when it was the 10th largest paper in the country. Yeah. But I've also published economics articles in the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, Washington Post, and I've written a lot about the pricing of energy and carbon taxes for New York Times, Reason Magazine, Huffington Post, and many local papers as well.
For our viewers who are not familiar with that group of publications that you have written for, it's truly amazing that you have been able to get into the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Huffington Post, and some of the others. I mean, that is truly, you have to be good.
Well, thank you.
To do that.
And what I've done is worked on the interface between professional economists and the public, effectively trying to translate the best research being done by serious economists, not the sort of think tank pundits who are pushing an agenda, but really serious economists and the public, which I think wants and needs to know the best of their findings.
So would I be correct? You're sort of thinking about the economists out there that are doing serious work about energy and the environment, climate, and you're helping them share their technical message with sort of an educated lay audience.
Exactly. And much of their writing is highly technical and abstruse, but it comes up with really important messages. And again, helping them communicate those messages to the public is, I think, not only something the public is interested in, but policymakers really need to understand. And that's why every president has a President's Council of Economic Advisors to help them understand the best research, to help guide policy for the country. And as it happens, nearly every former chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, along with just about every living Nobel laureate in economics, supports carbon taxes, which is the subject of our show today.
I'll come to carbon tax in a second, but this is a difficult question. Well, first of all, your education is in economics and writing, journalism?
Yes.
It's that. And the other thing is, I know when I do something, I sometimes have a framework in my mind, or I have some principles that I use to help me work with someone like you or work with a scientist, whatever. What do you have up here in terms of structure of thinking?
Well, first, I have a knowledge based on university study of economics and so forth, so I can understand a lot of the technical discussions. As a former professional journalist, I also have an understanding of how to tell stories so that people can understand them, because research that's off just in the so-called ivory tower doesn't do a lot of good.
Go ahead.
And thirdly, and this is something I've had to work on over the years, is trying to keep an open mind. I have, along with many economists, realized some early assumptions I've made haven't been necessarily correct. So I look where the empirical findings take me, as opposed to trying to defend some theoretical model that I had when I was 22 years old, and I'm never going to budge from there.
So the mind is still open to things. Now, a climate tax, what's the significance? I mean, I think it's one of the most important solutions to help save us, but what do you think about it?
Okay, well, first of all, what is a carbon tax? It's kind of an unfortunate jargon name, because every living thing has carbon. We're not taxing trees. A carbon tax refers to a tax on emissions of carbon dioxide, which is the preeminent greenhouse gas that's warming up the atmosphere in the globe.
No, what about methane?
Methane is a secondary but important greenhouse gas, and it can be affected by a carbon tax, but a lot of methane emissions will probably need to be addressed through specific regulatory policies. For example, this is just one of many sources of methane emissions, but land use methods can affect them. So can cattle raising. Cows burp methane, and if you promote certain kinds of cattle feed, it will reduce their methane emissions, and you can keep farmers going. But the primary emission is carbon dioxide, and the idea of a carbon tax is to tax fossil fuels, typically the sale of fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal, primarily among them. And here's a simple way of thinking about it. Economists say, if there's a bad thing you don't want, we'll tax it. And the best example of that is the tobacco tax. The World Health Organization has stated in a major report with the National Cancer Institute that the single most effective policy ever applied to reduce lung cancer is the tobacco tax. And the evidence is overwhelming that it's reduced use of tobacco and cigarettes, especially among young people who are very sensitive to prices. Before they get hooked, if the price of a pack of cigarettes goes up, they don't try them. So if we apply the same principle to fossil fuels, it will discourage the use of fossil fuels by individuals and companies and so forth, and give all of us an incentive to seek out more efficient ways of using energy and more ways of using clean energy.
I'm with you. Has any country already applied a carbon tax?
Actually, quite a few have. Unfortunately, many of them are doing it in a sort of half-baked way, very low levels. Canada just imposed a nationwide carbon tax, very similar to the model that Citizens Climate Lobby is proposing. But a country like Sweden, for example, first imposed a carbon tax in 1991. They've had one of the strongest economies in the world since then, and they emit 1/4 as much CO2 per person as the United States. That's a pretty extraordinary record.
But the United States emissions per capita is like that compared to just about everybody else. I think I forget the numbers right now, but it's huge. But anyway, the point you're making is Sweden has implemented a tax on carbon and still their economy is flourishing.
Flourishing. The United Kingdom imposed a tax just on the electric power sector just about 7 years ago. And in just 7 years, they have nearly wiped out the use of coal in electric power production.
What country? The UK?
Yeah, and that's phenomenal. That's like one of the most dramatic shifts in electric power generation seen anywhere in the world. And as you know, coal is the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. It's also incredibly dirty, so that one of the benefits of discouraging coal use is you actually save lives.
Yes.
Thousands and thousands of lives are lost due to particulate emissions and so forth.
I'm interested. France implemented a new tax, I believe, on gasoline. Was that a carbon tax?
It was a carbon tax should cover all sectors, because the atmosphere doesn't care whether the CO2 comes from cars or industry or agriculture. You want, ideally, a tax across the board, but you're right.
Okay.
France tried to implement a new higher tax on gasoline and got a minor revolt called the Yellow Vest movement.
Yes, yes.
And that's sometimes taken as a sign that no one will accept carbon taxes, except, as I said, there are carbon taxes now in several dozen countries around the world, including Canada. British Columbia has had one since 2008. The problem in France was the government was very arrogant in terms of they had just cut the wealth tax, so it was sending a sign that the rich were going to get off easy.
Yeah.
Then they threw on this gasoline tax. And here's the thing, you have to be smart about a carbon tax. You can't just say, let's slam everyone with a huge, there are lots of people who depend on their cars or pickup trucks or whatever, and home heating. You can't do it overnight. And the proposal that I support and Citizens Climate Lobby supports, and an overwhelming number of economists support, would gradually raise a carbon tax so it doesn't hit people over the head, and then takes all the revenue and returns it to every American in the form of an equal check every month. That is something that France should have done.
Yes.
It's something that Canada is doing, and that would eliminate this opposition.
Does it return the money to taxpayers?
To every individual, because every individual uses energy, right? Whether or not they pay an income tax. So they will be paying indirectly, because the tax falls on fossil fuel companies that sell fossil fuels, but they will pass some of those costs downstream. So we will all pay something.
Okay. If I have everyone who has a Social Security number, that's how it happens?
Roughly, or a taxpayer ID, either one.
Okay. And now you said the suppliers of the fossil fuel get taxed. Does that mean if I have an oil well, or if I have a mine, or I'm an operator of a mine, or fracking gas, whoever brings up the fossil fuel, and I want to now sell it to Exxon, BP, or somebody else, who's paying the tax? BP?
No, it would be the producer. Whoever is digging out the coal or pulling up the oil and gas from the ground or importing it from abroad, any one of those would pay the tax. The beautiful thing is, by the way, they already pay federal excise taxes, very small, but there's no new bureaucracy that's needed. There are about 3,000 entities today that pay these taxes, and all you have to do is raise the tax on them,
Yeah.
and problem solved.
All right. Do they get a tax break?
No.
No. Okay.
They're paying taxes. Ideally, because it makes no sense to have this tax and subsidies, we should also, of course, as this is a no-brainer, we need to end subsidies. Why should taxpayers be subsidizing the production of fossil fuels?
Right.
That should be a universal given.
Right. So those two things go together. A
Yes.
tax on the actual producers of the raw energy.
Right.
And at the same time, remove the incentives, the financial incentives, the tax incentives we give those folks. And now that oil that comes up out of the ground may be made into gasoline.
Right.
And so Exxon buys the oil.
Or they may produce it themselves, but yes.
They produce it themselves, and their product is now more expensive.
Right.
And which is fine. And this is all using market forces to reduce the supply of the oil in this particular case. But now I have to pay more money for gasoline.
That's right.
And I'm somebody who's living 9 to 5, working at McDonald's. I'm a Trump voter. And I'm concerned that I'm going to be paying more for gasoline. How do you handle that?
Fair enough. Okay. A lot of people come up with ideas for eliminating the internal combustion engine or massive gas taxes, and those would probably be great for the environment, but you're quite right. There are a lot of people who would suffer, and as a result, they would oppose this. It turns out the Treasury Department did a study a couple of years ago of who would gain and who would lose from a significant carbon tax. They set the level at one that would probably increase the price of gasoline around 50 cents a gallon. It would also raise other kinds of energy prices a little bit as well. They found that 2/3 of all Americans would end up benefiting from a system that raised the prices of fossil fuels but returned the money as a form of an equal dividend. Now think about it. If I'm a low-income person, first of all, I don't use a huge amount. I'm not flying off to France for vacations. I don't have 3 cars and so on and so forth. So economists for years have studied people's annual consumption budgets. They know what low-income people spend their money on, so they can figure out how much more they will pay with a carbon tax. They can also project how much money will come in from a carbon tax and thus go in a monthly check. It turns out in about 5 years, a family of 4 would be getting over the course of a full year about $3,400 in these dividend checks.
Okay.
Now, $3,400 is a lot of money to someone who's making $20,000
Sure
a year.
is.
It's not a heck of a lot of money if you're making $300,000 or if you're Michael Bloomberg. But it turns out that when you look across the income spectrum, 2/3 of Americans end up making more money than they lose.
Okay.
The other good thing is, whatever you think of wealth taxes and higher income taxes, those are a separate issue. They're very important. But the rich are not going to be clobbered by this either. They'll pay like 1% to 2% more than they are now.
Sure.
And they can afford that. I think we all agree.
Yes.
So no billionaire should object. Now you might say, well, what good is the tax with them? There are not very many billionaires, so they're not probably the biggest source of the problem. But I must say, some of them will think twice about buying 450-foot yachts that run on kerosene and waste. They're going to see their bills just going up and up. And they may even think, what the heck do I need this status symbol for? It's just a waste of money.
Yeah. I'd just like you to nail one point down. I'm working at McDonald's, and my taxes, my gasoline is now more expensive.
Right.
And yes, I heard you clearly. I don't use a lot, but relatively speaking, if I'm at McDonald's, whatever I use is a lot. Will I get a check
You'll be getting a check every month. As I said, the check
Wow.
will almost certainly be greater than the increased cost you're paying. But here's one of the benefits, okay? If you do nothing, you'll probably still make a little more money. It's like a stealth guaranteed annual income almost. But it will also give you, along with every other American, an incentive to think hard about how I get to McDonald's. Maybe I should try to take the bus more often.
Yes.
Maybe I can carpool with a friend. There are options, and I don't mean to like arrogantly say, you know, it's easy for everyone to come up with a better way of getting there. But I do think many of us do have options. And for example, the next time you, working at McDonald's, come to buy a car, you're going to think hard about the fuel economy of that car,
Sure.
which is a good thing. And there are economic vehicles that don't cost any more than gas guzzlers. Right now, people are buying SUVs because the price of gas is less than the price of water in many cases. If the price of gasoline started going up, people would not only revert to lower, better mileage sedans, but they would also start looking again at electric vehicles.
So now I'd like to ask you, since you're in the media, okay, and you've written, and your job is to educate, inform, attract readers, but can you get that message out that I, a McDonald's worker, am going to get a check every month to offset the monies I'm paying extra? Can you really educate and inform enough of the people out there to call, or at least not call, their congressperson or the House of Representative and complain?
Good question. Well, the good news, first of all, is that there have been a number of polls done, including one by a Republican pollster, showing that a majority of American voters and American adults support taxing fossil fuel companies as part of a climate solution. About 60 to 70%, including a slight majority of Republicans. That's really significant. The organization I work with, Citizens Climate Lobby, is a nonprofit, grassroots-based organization with more than 400 chapters across the country and a growing number internationally. And it has been doing the job of talking with Americans, writing letters to the editor, op-ed pieces, talking with local clubs, chambers of commerce, and so on, getting that message out. And every year, it holds citizens lobby events in Washington, D.C. to talk with just about every member of Congress about this solution in a bipartisan way, which is really important. To get a solution that sticks, hard as it is, I mean, we live in a very polarized, ugly environment. It's going to take, you know, some measure of bipartisanship. And the success has been striking. There is a bill in Congress, I really urge people to look at it, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. It's H.R. 763. It now has a remarkable 79, and that number will probably be soon out of date, co-sponsors. And the number has been growing steadily. This is probably the most widely supported climate bill in Congress today, and it would levy a carbon tax that starts low and goes up every year to really bite. And in 10 years, it would cut greenhouse gas emissions by about 40%. And by 2050, it would cut them by about 80%. It's not the only solution we need, but it's a huge part of the solution. So the fact that it's getting so much support in Congress, I think means that, you know, and no one likes to raise taxes, but legislators understand that a carbon fee and dividend that's rebated back to people, just like the Alaska oil dividend, that's an incredibly popular program in Alaska. And that's why Canada adopted a measure like this. Yeah. They know that this can be very popular, in fact.
Who in Congress initiated this bill?
There were a Democrat and a Republican from Florida who Florida is going to be underwater soon. And so it's gotten support from people as progressive as Barbara Lee, for example.
Barbara Lee, I heard that name.
But lots of from Oakland, but also many more conservative Democrats and so on. People who like market-based solutions. There are the famous economist and Republican statesman George Shultz is a huge.
Oh, George, yes. Actually, he put a plan together, an energy climate plan, before Trump was elected, and he had a whole bunch of people at Stanford that put it together. He's about to give it to Hillary, and then he tells me, no, the guy who's taken office now, who got elected, he doesn't read, he doesn't believe in climate change. I've never submitted
Shultz
his plan.
is part of a bipartisan group that's actually been getting a lot of press that supports a slightly different version of a carbon fee and dividend, but it's the same basic, it would start a little higher and rise a little less fast, but the basic concept is the same. Janet Yellen, who is a prominent Democratic economist, she was head of the Federal Reserve Board under President Obama, very eminent economist. She's a huge champion of this, and she helped collect signatures from over 3,500 economists to support this as the most cost-effective lever for reducing greenhouse gas emissions at the scale and speed that is necessary to address this crisis. I can tell you, as someone who has written about economics for many years, there is no issue in history that has achieved this level of consensus among economists. So,
since that's so important, tell me again, how many economists have signed up?
More than 3,500.
More than 3,500.
Every 27 Nobel laureates, former heads of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, former presidents of the Federal Reserve Board, Republicans and Democrats. It's an extraordinary consensus.
Yes.
Basically equal, you've probably heard that something like 97% of climate scientists believe climate change is real and caused by human behavior. That's just a fact at that point. Well, it's the same with the expert view of carbon taxes.
Okay.
And they know this not just because of vague theoretical models, but because of the experience that I pointed to in many countries around the world, other kinds of taxes. We've had taxes on alcohol and tobacco. We know that these work.
Okay, if I wanted to read one of your most important articles about this topic, can I do that?
I have some papers available through Citizens Climate Lobby, and how accessible they are on the public website, I'm embarrassed to say, I'm not sure.
Would you be willing to send one of them, the most important to me, and maybe I will put it up on my site?
I would be more than happy to.
Okay, and now I'd like to ask, what is going to happen in the future? Is Citizen Climate Lobby or the George Shultz faction, are they going to do something really significant in the very near future to get more members of Congress to sign on?
The number of co-sponsors has been going up at a fast clip, but there is no question that in today's political environment, this concept is not going to be enacted into law. I think it's going to take citizen voters in the 2020 elections voting as if their future really is at stake here. Climate matters, and I think a huge number of voters now finally recognize that the climate crisis has to be one of the top issues of the day. And if they vote accordingly, we may get a new president and a new Congress that takes climate seriously and acts. The beautiful thing is, by having this bill already in the hopper with these co-sponsors, if we get a new political environment, we could pass it into law very quickly and begin seeing dramatic changes in our behavior. And let me just add one other thing, because some skeptics rightly point out that the US is only one of many sources of greenhouse gases. This bill also has powerful instruments in it that would encourage the rest of the world to begin getting on board with carbon taxes. If they want to trade their goods into the United States, they would pay a higher tariff unless they have carbon taxes of their own.
Good.
And as the world's biggest or second biggest market, we would have enormous clout in speeding up the world getting on board with a solution.
I just want to say something. I'll come right back to
Okay.
that. My guest has been Jonathan Marshall. He's clearly a knowledgeable economist, and he's written for some of the greatest, most respected publications in the world. I'm happy he's here. Then I'd like to share what Stanford University is going to do in June when they hold their Silicon Valley Energy Summit 2020. They have asked me to make a painting, that big one, about 6 foot high, that will articulate what I tend to think are the 5 most important solutions that can help stop climate change. One of those solutions I will paint is carbon tax. And I've actually done it a few years ago where I had Don Quixote in a painting with Dulciana, and the two of them were working to suppress greenhouse gases using a tax. Again, I am Michael Killen. Thank you very much. And Jonathan, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.